Well, welcome to Whole Bible Study with your host, me, Taddy Noy. Now, as we continue our journey through Scripture, moving chapter by chapter from Genesis to Leviticus so far, we arrive at two of the most tightly woven yet deeply provocative chapters in the Torah, Leviticus chapter 17 and 18. These chapters aren't isolated rules or moral codes dropped out of heaven. They emerge from a world where identity, survival, and sacred order were constantly negotiated, and in the face of chaos, conquest, and assimilation. By now, if you've been with me from the beginning, you'll know that there's nothing in these ancient texts that is incidental. Everything is doing something. And here Leviticus is doing something decisive, reshaping a people who had been liberated from Egyptian bondage into a community that could withstand the cultural weight of empire, exile, and memory. We've already explored the architecture of sacrifice, the drama of impurity and purification, and the liturgical climax of the Day of Atonement in chapter 16. The central ritual offered a national recalibration, a purging of both individual sin and collective contamination. It symbolically reset the cosmic scales. But if chapter 16 was the turning point, then chapter 17 begins the long descent into lived holiness, the Holiness Code, as scholars call this stretch from chapter 17 to chapters 26 that begin right here. And it starts with two visceral realities: blood and sexuality. These aren't arbitrary topics. They're primal. They speak to life, death, generation, and identity. And Leviticus frames both within a system of covenantal order, where the boundary between the sacred and the profane, between communion and violation, becomes a matter of survival. If you want to hear the live reading, go to my Bible building podcast on this channel. That's where they'll exist now. Leviticus chapter 17 opens a rule that would have reshaped Israel's everyday life. No more killing animals in open fields. Every animal intended for sacrifice must be brought to the central sanctuary. The Hebrew here is precise. The term used for the, quote, tent of meeting, ohel moed, offers not just to a physical structure, but to the ritualized meeting point between heaven and earth. To kill an animal without presenting it there isn't just unlawful, it's an act of defiance against the divine center of life. The rationale is made explicit. In verse 11, we read, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your lives." The Hebrew word for blood, dam, doesn't simply refer to a bodily fluid. It is, in ancient Hebrew worldview, dam signified vitality itself, the visible substance of breath, energy, and divine gift. To shed blood was to release life, and to consume it was to absorb something sacred and potentially dangerous. Historical records from neighboring cultures, Ugaritic, Canaanite, even Mesopotamian, demonstrate that blood was often used in ritual contexts. In some Canaanite cults, it was consumed in communion with ancestral spirits. The Mesopotamian temples, it could be sprinkled or poured as a part of necromantic rites. Archaeological finds as Rosh Hashanah, for example, show offerings where blood was symbolically shared between humans and deities. But Leviticus draws a firm boundary here. Blood is not for human manipulation or consumption. It is exclusively for sacrificial atonement. A tightly regulated transaction between Israel and Yahweh. This regulation is not just theological, it's deeply anthropological. The anthropologist Mary Douglas, whose book Purity and Danger remains essential reading for Leviticus, argues that such prohibitions organize the world into clean categories. Blood, as both life and death, is inherently liminal. It crosses boundaries, and in cultures where order was sacred and disorder a threat to communal cohesion, boundary maintenance was essential. To control blood was to control the line between life and death, sacred and profane, chaos and order. The text explicitly links unauthorized sacrifice with offerings to goat demons. In Hebrew, sechrim, these are likely desert spirits or wilderness entities associated with the underworld in the ancient Near Eastern folklore. Some scholars see them as mythic remnants of pre-Israelite religion. Others suggest they represent foreign cultic practices, perhaps even Egyptian animal deities, which the priests of Leviticus sought to isolate and reject. Either way, the implication is clear. Unregulated sacrifice opens the door to idolatry, chaos, and syncretism. The repeated command not to consume blood, found in verses 10 through 14, is striking, not only in its repetition, but in its rationale. The text does not say don't eat blood because it's dirty or because pagans do it. It says it is the life of all flesh. Its blood is its life. The prohibition is rooted in cosmology. In a vision of life the vision of life is divinely owned and death is ritually potent. The Mishnah and later Talmudic writings elaborate this further, turning abstination from blood into a sign of covenant humility. The idea is that you don't grasp at life, you return it, its symbol and its symbols, to God. From this theme of regulated life force, the text moves seamlessly into Leviticus 18, where we find an equally detailed and controversial set of boundaries, this time concerning sexuality. And again, the issue is not about personal morality in a modern sense, but about social structure, identity, and sacred order. The chapter begins with an instruction that echoes through the whole Holiness Code. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, or as they do in the land of Canaan. This is not simply a command to be morally better. It's a call to cultivate distinctiveness. Israel is not just another nation. It is a people with a different story, and that story is written into the bodies, relationships, and generational lines. The Hebrew word for holiness, kadosh, literally means set apart. And here, holiness takes on an intensity. It takes on an intensely embodied form. One who sleeps with, one who marries, what unions are permitted. These become mechanisms for preserving the covenant community. This is especially visible when we examine the Hebrew euphemism that appears repeatedly in the chapter. It's translated to uncover nakedness. This phrase, far from being clinical, evokes a sense of vulnerability, exposure, and disruption of protective coverings. To uncover is not just to act sexually. It is to violate a line that was meant to remain drawn, to a protective border around kin, community, and covenant. Scholars like John Dominic Crossan and Jacob Milgrom have argued that the list of prohibitions in Leviticus 18 reflects an agrarian society's need to protect inheritance systems and prevent internal power concentration. In a tribal world where marriage often reinforced alliances and land passed through family lines, sexual boundaries were also economic and political boundaries. Incest threatened inheritance clarity. Adultery endangered clan honor. Male intercourse, which is briefly mentioned, may have carried symbolic overtones of domination and boundary blurring. In a world where hierarchy and gender roles were socially rigid, importantly, modern scholars caution that these prohibitions reflect ancient categories of purity and kinship, not necessarily modern categories of identity or orientation. The word often translated as abomination, to'av, is crucial here. It examines in its original context. It doesn't mean something absolutely evil in a timeless sense. Rather, it refers to what is ritually or culturally taboo. that violates a specific community's sacred structure. In Leviticus, Ta'evach marks a behavior that disrupts Israel's covenant distinctiveness. Scholar Tiva Friar Kinsky has shown how such labels were about preserving internal cohesion in a volatile world, not about universal ethical condemnation. What's especially striking is how the text ties these sexual violations to the land itself. Verse 25 warns that the land will vomit out its inhabitants if these abominations are practiced. This isn't poetic hyperbole. It reflects a theological anthropology in which human behavior is intimately tied to geography. The land is not inert property. It's a covenantal partner. Violating its moral spatial order is like poisoning the soil. The idea that the earth responds to human ethics is not unique to Israel. Parallels exist in Hittite and Akkadian legal texts. But in Leviticus, it becomes a core theme. Later Jewish literature includes jubilees, and various texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls read these laws as cosmic. For writers in the Second Temple period, the transgression of sexual and sacrificial boundaries didn't just harm individuals. It defiled creation itself. George Nicholsburg, a leading scholar of Jewish apocalypticism, notes that these texts framed moral decay as cosmic crisis, echoing the flood narrative and anticipating divine judgment. Early Christianity inherited some of these concerns though often reinterpreted. In Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council includes abstination from blood and sexual immorality among the minimal requirements for Gentile converts, showing the enduring symbolic weight of these Levitical boundaries. Now, Paul, writing within this world, reframes sexual ethics in terms of the body as a temple, another echo of Levitical space and sanctity. And yet, history complicates how these texts are used. In Christian history, Leviticus 18 has often been weaponized, selectively invoked while ignoring context, linguistic nuance, or historical function. That's why scholars like Elaine Pagels have urged modern readers to approach these texts not as static moral codes, but as dynamic records of communal negotiating its survival through boundaries, myth, and law. The point here is not to dissolve the text's seriousness. On the contrary, it's to recover it. Leviticus 17 and 18 are not about arbitrary rules. They are about life and generation, about how a people learns to steward life's most powerful forces without letting those forces unravel them. They are about saying, this is not mine to consume recklessly. This body is not mine to join however I wish. This community is not mine to shape without reference to the sacred story we belong to. These texts challenge us, not just ethically, but anthropologically. They ask, what does it mean to live with limits? What does it mean to inhabit a world where the sacred is not confined to temples, but saturates our kitchens, our beds, even our blood? And yet they also invite us to reverence, to care, to order. They remind us that even the most intimate acts carry covenantal weight, that holiness is not abstract, but textured and embodied, and that being set apart is not about exclusion, but about fidelity to a story that spans generations. Well, thank you for walking through these chapters with me. May the wisdom of these ancient boundaries and the courage to engage them honestly guide your own journey towards reverence, restraint, and a deeper sacred belonging. If this conversation speaks to you, I invite you to share it, discuss it, and I will see you in the next chapter soon.